Yes, folks, since the media called the election for Biden, it has been interesting to watch how many political leaders around the world have congratulated Biden without him even being officially elected. But I am more concerned about how many commentators on Fox News and Sky News Australia that are now beginning to show their true colours, and Andrew Bolt is one of them. He has been a complete never-Trumper dick since the election. Here's a sample of him trying to defend himself.
I've had so much abuse since saying last week that Donald Trump has lost the election and should leave. Leave with grace. Now, I've been told by Trump supporters, even by some of you, that I lack fight, that I lack balls, that I'm just jumping the ship. I'm a fake conservative.
Well, that's exactly what you are right now.
My friends, it is the opposite. I know that other people here on Sky News think that Trump is being robbed. They think they have evidence of voter fraud and it is their right to pursue it. But that does not make them, or my critics, any truer conservatives than me. In fact, accepting the clear verdict of an election is exactly the conservative thing to do.
But the verdict is not clear.
And that's why I was appalled that so many people on the left, people now screaming for Trump to accept that he's lost, wouldn't accept that Trump had actually won 4 years ago. They claimed for years without evidence that he wasn't the legitimate president at all, that he'd somehow colluded with Russia to steal the 2016 election. That was false. It was wrong. And same deal. It's wrong now for Trump supporters to cry fraud against Joe Biden. That's wrong too. I mean, I could do it and get many more hits, a lot more success preaching to the base, but I won't do it because it's not the conservative thing to do. Not trashing confidence in democracy with no...
What democracy? After 4 years of the Democrats lying and cheating, aided by the fake news media, fake polls, and big tech, you talk about democracy? Yeah, anyway, Daisy Cousins sets him straight.
Now, Daisy, something that without a shadow of a doubt, has been hot on social media, the US election. Twitter, for one, has been working overtime to censor tweets by Donald Trump claiming voter fraud. Warnings on so many, you've got to click through to see them, disproves. Look at that, it's just one after the other. And then many of the major TV networks stopped broadcasting a press conference by the president, who's still the president. The black squares represent those stations that cut him off as soon as he started to claim he was robbed, that there was some voter fraud out there. Now, I don't agree with him that the fraud is of a kind that, so significant to have flipped the election. But I find it so ominous, this censorship, that major TV networks would not even let the president make his case.
Yet here you are calling the American election democratic.
What do you make of all this?
Well, I'm sure you remember a couple of weeks ago I said that the censorship of content about the Hunter Biden laptop scandal was the worst censorship I'd ever seen on Twitter and in the media. Well, this is worse. This is infinitely worse. I have never seen anything like this, Andrew. Any kind of tweet, not just from Donald Trump, but from anyone that mentions the possibility that there's even a slight irregularity in the election result is being dismissed and censored. And as you say, you have to click through a dozen warnings to actually get there. And this is despite the fact that Twitter allowed any mention of Russian collusion, which is a far far less believable theory than a little bit of domestic interference to trend all over the place. And what irritates me, Andrew, is I know Donald Trump is talking very specifically about fraud, but look, think about it. He has to fire up the base, and the best way to keep them engaged and interested and fighting hard, of course, is to talk about fraud. But there are actually some very legitimate legal challenges, and which are totally non-controversial. There's often litigation after a US election, recounts, etc., that could potentially have an effect on the results. And what's irritating me is that there is simply not enough discussion of this in the media, who have decided that they have the constitutional power to call the election for Joe Biden. That is completely false. The media has no power at all to call the election. Joe Biden is not the president-elect just because CNN says so, when the votes have not been verified. The count
Exactly.
hasn't finished, and legal action is only just starting to be brought. One that is of particular note is the case of, say, poll watchers in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania who were not permitted. There have been multiple reports. They were prevented from actually watching and verifying the count, often quite aggressively, which would possibly mean the Republicans will argue that those votes that were counted in that manner were counted illegally and should therefore be disqualified. The second one that could be particularly interesting, this I think is the strongest case they have, is again in Pennsylvania, where the Republicans have brought to the Supreme Court of the United States, the biggest court in the land, that the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania unconstitutionally ruled that ballots could be received up to 3 days after the election in Pennsylvania, when the legislature had ruled earlier in the year in Pennsylvania that that was not the case. They had to be received by Election Day. The Supreme Court of the United States saw this matter before the election, indicated they were concerned that this ruling was constitutional, and that they will review it again after the election. Given the makeup of the court, which is of course a 6-3 conservative majority, many of them constitutional originalists, it is highly likely, Andrew, that they will in fact rule in favor of the Republicans, which would mean that any ballot received after the election day, which have been instructed to be kept separate, will be struck off. If that's the case, that most likely means that the state of Pennsylvania and all of its 20 electoral college votes will go to Donald Trump. Add to that the fact that the count in Arizona has not finished, and the Republicans are pretty confident, it seems, still that they will eventually win Arizona, since the gap is narrowing. That takes away 31 electoral college votes from Joe Biden, which pulls him under the 270 minimum that he needs, and that throws the whole thing wide open again. Then it's down to the state of Georgia and their recount. So shame on the media for declaring that, according to them, Joe Biden is now suddenly the president of the United States, and shame on Kamala Harris and Joe Biden for using this as their cue to make their so-called victory speeches when nothing is verified. The count hasn't even finished, and we have yet to see what the courts decide.
Yes, so shut up, Bolt. And of course, Alan Jones sets him straight as well.
Well, when you look at the alliance of political power mobilised against Trump, the financial power of outfits like Google, Facebook and Twitter, who refuse to publish legitimate stories about Biden, and I can assure you these stories won't go away, but media power, social media, mainstream media, the cultural power in Hollywood, all were anti-Trump. As Greg Sheridan wrote over the weekend, quote, big tech, social media and almost all mainstream media were all in for Biden. Social media, he said, crossed a dangerous Rubicon when it started censoring Trump and mainstream newspapers and conservatives if they weren't backing Biden, unquote. Wrote Greg Sheridan, quote, this is the most sinister, anti-democratic and genuinely disturbing development of this election. Well, if the determination to beat Trump was so overwhelming, what tactic wouldn't they stop at? As Greg Jones of Cogra wrote at the weekend, quote, in Wisconsin, won by Joe Biden, the 60-year average voter turnout, 60 years, is 67%. This year it was reportedly 89%, a 5.5 standard deviation from the historical average. We might expect this, he said, in Turkey or Zimbabwe, but not in America. And it's unsurprising that Donald Trump's camp, he says, is unsettled. Well, Donald Trump is being hammered for saying, and I quote, if you count the legal votes, I easily win. If you count the illegal votes, they can try to steal the election from us. And he also said, quote, these really phony fake polls were designed to keep our voters at home. Our numbers started miraculously getting whittled away in secrecy, unquote. Well, this is the business about mail-in ballots. Almost 100 million Americans voted before the day. Of those who walked into the ballot box on the day, the overwhelming majority backed Trump. The reported turnout was 67% of eligible voters, the highest in a century. Trump won Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona and Georgia in 2016. These were the seats, you'll recall, when they stopped counting on the night of the election, and no one could explain why they stopped. Trump was a mile in front. Pennsylvania, 57% of the vote. Georgia, 52%. Michigan, 54%. Wisconsin, 54%. I went off air on Wednesday night. Trump was leading in Wisconsin, 54-46. Suddenly, 100,000 votes lobbed in Biden's lap. None for Trump. Trump was leading 54-43 in Michigan. But thousands and thousands of votes materialised overnight for Biden. In last Wednesday night's program, I went into detail about ballot harvesting in Minneapolis by Democrat workers paying Somali immigrants and people in aged care for their ballots. And the ballot harvester was saying, quote, I have 300 ballots in my car right now. Numbers don't lie. You can see my car's full. All these here are absentee ballots. A Minneapolis taxi driver was secretly recorded saying, we showed you this last week, I was given money so I could vote, $800. Well, of course, the left denies there's a problem. But the Heritage Foundation has documented instances in the past 4 years of voter fraud, false voter registrations, duplicate voting, fraudulent absentee ballots, vote buying, intimidation of voters, ineligible voting by foreigners, and altering the vote count. Donald Trump has filed lawsuits in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. One of the challenges involves whether a postal ballot should be counted when it's postmarked after the election day. Now, certainly ballots in the mail are accepted until November 10, which is a week after the election, so long as they are postmarked by election day. Have a look at this. Project Veritas is a group which I talked about last week when I spoke to the former chief of staff of Donald Trump. It uses undercover technology to reveal corruption and bias. I gave you detail last Thursday night of what was happening in relation to the buying of votes in Minnesota, which Biden won with 10 electoral college votes. Project Veritas was told by a former political worker that before Minnesota's Democratic primary on August 8, ballot harvesters, quote, took every single ballot, unquote, from elderly people in a Minneapolis public housing complex. Well, have a look at this from Project Veritas.
Tell us where you work.
I work in the Traverse City Post Office, more specifically the Barlow branch.
Your boss told you and your colleagues something that shocked you this morning. What was it?
We were issued a directive this morning to collect any ballots we find in mailboxes, collection boxes, just outgoing mail in general, separate them at the end of the day so that they could hand stamp them with the previous day's date. Today is November 4th, for clarification.
Who is your boss and what is his title?
Jonathan would be a direct supervisor, yes. As of right now, he is the opening supervisor for the Barlow branch post office. So and this is anecdotal, carrier down in another office said they watched the postmaster doing it. If it were just a typical day, it would be clerks doing it up at the distribution center.
So 8 p.m. election day, November 3rd, the Court of Appeals ruled ballots have to be received by that time. And what were you told?
To separate them today so they could mark them with yesterday's date and send them through the express system to wherever they needed to go.
This appears to be an attempt to circumvent Michigan law and allow late votes. And you said there was a hamper where letter carriers were supposed to leave their ballots. Where are the ballots now?
They were putting them into express bags to go to the distribution center. In regards to a hamper, there was a standard hamper that all letter mail is supposed to go to, and they had a tub next to it that we were supposed to put any ballots collected today into.
Yes. What made you come forward?
That's sketchy. I don't like sketchy. It screams corruption. Also knowing the post office's leanings politically.
Yeah, the post office's leanings politically. And that's the fundamental problem with postal voting. You don't know who's going to interfere with your vote on the way.
Didn't seem quite right.
We'll have to reach out to Jonathan Clark for comment. Hey, is this Jonathan?
Yes.
Hey, I'm a reporter with Project Veritas, James O'Keefe here, and I have information that you guys have been stamping ballots with the previous date, November 3rd. He just hung up the phone on me.
Well, there you are. Making sure the ballot is postmarked by election day. Now, one of the Trump team have gone to court to challenge the fact that their scrutineers were not allowed near where the votes were being counted. Quite frankly, American elections are virtually the amateur hour of politics. There are more than 10,000 different entities responsible for the administration of the presidential campaign. It's open slather. Here, federal elections are conducted by an independent national entity, the Australian Electoral Commission, and even then we've got concerns. Well, so too does Cory Bernardi, the former senator and former member of the Liberal Party, who knows the American political scene, having studied it in America for many months. He joins me. Cory, good evening to you. Thank you for your time. What are we to make of all of this?
Well, Alan, we should be desperately concerned because there's a lot riding on it. And what worries me the most is the normally sensitive, sensible, conservative commentators who have been bullied by the media into saying, no, Trump should concede. There's no evidence that there is any fraud or systemic problem. And you've demonstrated some of it there, but I can tell you in Michigan, there's documented that there are 10,000 dead people who have voted. Now, I don't know how many of those votes were actually counted, but 10,000 dead people voted. And I can tell you now that's impossible, but they did. And so there's a question to be asked there. We know the counting machines, the voting machines which are in Michigan and used in 30 other states, suddenly switched. One of them switched from Biden votes, Trump votes to Biden votes, and that changed the outcome in that particular area. There are so many questions here that the only way to follow them through is to follow due process, which is what is mandated under the Constitution. You can go to court. The election is not decided until the 14th of December when the Electoral College meets. And those people who have said Trump should concede, those people who have said there is no evidence of any fraud or collusion or any problem with this election at all are just mind-numbing. They've suspended any rational thought is how the only way I can say it, Alan.
Let our viewers, Cory, have a look at this tweet. Cory tweeted this to me today, and have a look at these people on the tweet. One of them, you'll see, one of them's born, in 1850?
Yeah, a happy 170th birthday to Lemoyne, I think his middle name is.
Yes.
Alan, they were seven people. They were all over 100 years of age. 5 of them actually returned ballots into that thing. Now, I don't know how many of them were disqualified, but the simple fact is that dead people are being recorded as voting. And everyone says there's nothing wrong here. We know Pennsylvania, we know Illinois, have a rabid history of voter fraud. And it was only earlier this year, actually, I think the president of the Senate in Pennsylvania was actually imprisoned. We've had judges that have been taking money to ballot stuff. We know the counting machine issues are there. We know there are software programs which the US intelligence agencies have been using internationally. We don't know whether they've been used domestically. But there are so many questions. And anyone that says Donald Trump is not within his rights to go through this process, present the evidence to the court and have the courts make a decision is not a serious constitutionalist.
I agree with you. I agree. Sorry?
I was going to say, I heard today someone say about how good George W. Bush was coming out and praising. But you go back, George W. Bush pushed and pushed and pushed for 37 days to get Al Gore out of the system. Al Gore conceded, but if he hadn't conceded and had done a statewide recount in Florida, Al Gore would have been president of the United States.
So where do you think this is going?
There is a lot going for this.
Yeah, where do you think it's going? Where do you think it's going to finish up, Cory? You know the scene.
Well, it's absolutely got to go to the Supreme Court. I think there are still live and active races, irrespective of the court outcomes. In some of them, I think they've called them far too early. But ultimately, I think the next president is going to be decided by the rulings of the US Supreme Court.
Good.
Exactly. So shut up, Bolt. Yeah, now folks, don't get me wrong. I normally agree with most of what Bolt says, but in respect of Trump, he's got it completely wrong. Trump needs to fight for democracy all the way.